In the heart of ancient Rome, surrounded by marble pillars and golden mosaics, thousands of men stripped naked and slid into what they believed was the purest symbol of civilization, the public bath. The steamy air reeked of perfume, sweat, and something far less pleasant. If you think Roman baths were elegant sanctuaries of cleanliness, prepare yourself, because the truth? They were festering cauldrons of filth, disease, and human decay, far more disgusting than anything you could possibly imagine. We romanticize Roman baths as glittering social hubs, where philosophers debated, emperors relaxed, and the elite cleansed their bodies in luxury. But if you could travel back in time and take just one breath inside those steamy chambers, you'd probably vomit before you even touched the water. What the Romans called hygiene was actually a petri dish of everything humanity should have avoided. And it wasn't just gross, it was lethal. Let's start with what the ancient Romans called thermae, the grand public bathhouses that dotted every major city from Pompeii to Constantinople. Some could fit thousands of people at once. The baths of Caracalla, for example, could hold over 1,600 bathers simultaneously. The water shimmered under the sunlight pouring through high arches. But beneath that tranquil surface lurked a soup of dead skin, fecal residue, pus, sweat, and body oil so dense it could almost form a crust. And here's the worst part. They barely ever changed the water. According to studies by archaeologist Dr. Piers Mitchell, residue samples taken from ancient Roman baths revealed horrifying levels of human waste and disease-causing bacteria. Imagine a bathtub where the water's been used by hundreds of strangers, not once, but every single day for a week. That's what Romans proudly called civilized. Here's how a typical Roman bathing ritual went. You'd start by coating yourself in olive oil. Sounds nice, right? Luxurious even. But this wasn't for moisturization, it was because soap didn't exist. So they used oil to trap dirt and sweat on their skin. After working up a good sweat in the palaestra, the exercise yard, you'd head inside, dripping in oil, grime, and dead skin cells. Then, instead of washing, you'd take a curved metal scraper called a strigil and scrape it all off. The result? A greasy gray sludge of oil, filth, and body gunk that slid onto the floor. And since no one bothered to clean properly, that disgusting mixture often found its way straight into the pools. Slaves occasionally swept the floor, but occasionally in Rome meant when someone important complained. By the end of each day, the floors were slick with a film of human residue. The air was thick with the sour tang of sweat and the faint, metallic scent of blood. Because people didn't stop bathing even if they were injured. Open wounds, boils, skin infections, didn't matter. Everyone climbed in. The result was an environment perfect for spreading parasites, fungi, and bacterial diseases at a massive scale. Roman baths weren't just social clubs. They were slow-motion biohazards. And yet, to the Romans, bathing wasn't optional. It was an essential ritual tied to their identity as a clean and superior people. To skip the baths was to reject society itself. The Emperor Hadrian once tried to enforce separate bathing hours for men and women, citing moral reasons. The backlash was so intense, it nearly cost him his throne. That's how powerful the obsession was. The baths were where gossip flowed, deals were struck, and status was flaunted. But under the shimmering illusion of luxury, every surface crawled with invisible life. Now, here's where things get truly horrifying. You might assume the warm water at least killed some of the germs, right? Wrong. The tepid pools, heated by massive underground furnaces called hippocausts, were the perfect temperature for bacteria to thrive. Without chlorine or filtration, each bather contributed a personal offering to the growing microbial stew. Ancient texts describe bath water so cloudy you couldn't see your own feet. One writer, Marshall, complained that the water is so thick you could chew it. Researchers found traces of E. coli, Staphylococcus, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, all modern bacteria that cause severe infections. In simpler terms, if you took a dip in the Roman baths, you were swimming in human soup. But that's just the beginning. The tools themselves, the strigils, towels, and sponges, were communal. You didn't bring your own. You used what was provided, so imagine hundreds of strangers scraping dead skin and sweat off themselves with the same curved blade day after day. In some cases, slaves were tasked with collecting the used oil, filtering it through cloth, and reselling it to poor citizens as skincare. Yes, recycled human grime was an actual product. And speaking of slaves, their role in maintaining the baths was just as disturbing. They were responsible for cleaning, or pretending to. Armed with rough sponges and rags, they wiped down benches and floors already soaked in layers of filth. Many developed chronic skin conditions, infections, and even blindness from the constant exposure to contaminated water and heat. Yet, to the Roman elite, these men were invisible, as disposable as the filth they were forced to touch. Let's not forget that these same baths were also places of leisure. People ate, drank, gambled, and even conducted business inside. Vendors roamed the steamy corridors selling food and wine. Imagine chomping on olives while your neighbor scrapes pus off his thigh into the same pool you're about to step into. Hygiene wasn't just ignored, it was a foreign concept. And here's the most ironic part. Romans believed these baths were medicinal. Doctors prescribed bathing for everything from joint pain to infertility. But instead of curing people, the baths spread disease faster than any known method of the time. Epidemics of skin rashes, eye infections, and intestinal parasites were rampant, particularly among frequent bathers. One Roman physician, Galen, even noted that those who bathe daily often find themselves sicker than those who do not. He wasn't wrong. They were literally soaking in illness. The social expectation to bathe daily turned the Roman bathhouse into a slow-acting biological weapon. And because attendance was tied to one's reputation, no one dared question it. You either bathed, or you were seen as uncivilized. The irony is almost poetic. The empire that engineered aqueducts, plumbing, and heated floors was also drowning in its own filth. By the end of the day, as thousands of bodies cycled through the baths, the water became a swirling broth of everything the human body could shed. And everyone went home feeling clean. But clean in Rome meant something very different than it does today. In the flickering torchlight of the caldarium, the hottest chamber in the Roman bath complex, men lounged shoulder to shoulder, their bodies slick with sweat and oil, their voices echoing off marble walls. The steam was so thick it clung to their lungs. The smell, a heavy mix of perfume, mildew, and decay, hung in the air like a living thing. And in that haze of luxury, the Romans believed they had mastered cleanliness, but what they'd really done was create the perfect factory for disease. By the time an average Roman finished bathing, they were carrying more bacteria than when they entered. The body-scraping ritual with the strigil opened microcuts across their skin. These wounds invited infections from the filth floating in the water. Parasites swam freely, tiny invaders invisible to the naked eye. Pus from one man's sore mixed with another man's sweat. Blood seeped unnoticed into the same pool where children splashed and played. The warm, moist environment turned every bathhouse into an incubator of contagion. And because Romans didn't understand germ theory, they had no clue what they were spreading. They thought cleanliness came from the outside, the gleam of marble, the scent of incense, the heat of the air. What they couldn't see was what was rotting beneath that illusion. Archaeologists have found sediment in ancient bath drains containing parasite eggs, intestinal worms, and fecal bacteria so concentrated it rivals modern sewage systems. And yet, the Romans were proud of it. Their empire's greatness, they believed, could be measured by how many baths it had. In the end, that pride was their poison. Women had their own sections in some baths, but even there, the situation wasn't much better. Cosmetics, oils, and perfumes floated in a toxic mix that clung to everything. Hairdressers worked next to steaming pools, rinsing combs in the same water where dozens of strangers had soaked. The result was a city-wide epidemic of lice and skin fungus. Roman poets joked about it. Martial once mocked a man whose scalp looked like a battlefield of tiny worms. But the truth was darker. Those infestations could lead to open sores, infections, and permanent scarring. Yet people kept coming back because the baths weren't just about hygiene, they were about status. To be seen in the baths was to be seen as Roman. Senators held meetings there. Merchants made deals there. Even emperors attended, often followed by servants carrying scented oils and towels. Nero reportedly spent hours each day bathing in rose-infused water while musicians played nearby. The irony. His royal bathhouse was just as filthy as everyone else's. Even the emperor couldn't escape the invisible tide of bacteria swirling around him. Archaeological evidence shows that private imperial baths shared the same water systems as public ones. So while Nero relaxed in luxury, he was still bathing in recycled human soup from the streets below. And it wasn't just skin diseases or stomach parasites that haunted these places. The damp conditions also caused respiratory infections. Tuberculosis spread rapidly through the thick, humid air. The sound of coughing echoed through the halls. Eyes stung from the steam mixed with burning incense meant to mask the stench. Roman doctors recommended rubbing one's chest with goat fat to cure the cough. It didn't help. People died believing they were healing themselves through ritual purification, when in reality, the baths were killing them slowly. Still, the Romans believed the baths were divine. They built shrines to gods of health and fortune inside them. Statues of Hygeia, the goddess of cleanliness, stood beside pools of blackened scum. Offerings of flowers and coins sank into the muck. Priests blessed the water as if prayers could disinfect it. It was a tragic irony, worshipping purity while wallowing in waste. And yet, not everyone was blind to the rot. A few Roman writers hinted at the horror. Seneca, the philosopher who lived above a bathhouse, once wrote that the noise was unbearable. The grunting of men, the slapping of massages, the splash of divers, and the shrill cries of armpit hair pluckers advertising their services. He didn't mention the smell, but he didn't have to. The reader could imagine it. The same air that clouded his room carried the stench of 1,000 unwashed bodies pretending to be clean. By the 2nd century, the number of baths in Rome had exploded. Every neighborhood had one, every soldier on campaign had a portable version, and with each expansion came more contamination. The aqueducts fed the baths with fresh water, yes, but that water often passed through lead pipes. The Romans, in their brilliance, had poisoned themselves without realizing it. Lead seeped into everything: the water, the pools, the skin. Chronic exposure caused infertility, hallucinations, and madness. Some historians even believe it drove emperors like Caligula to insanity. So while the Romans relaxed in their steaming sanctuaries, their bodies were quietly breaking down from within. Now imagine this. After hours of soaking in that microbial stew, a Roman would step out, glistening with oil, and have a slave rub him down with a perfumed cloth that had been used dozens of times before. The cloth smelled faintly of lavender and sweat. The man would then slip into a toga, walk outside, and feel renewed, never realizing he carried half the empire's parasite population under his skin. That false sense of purity was the most dangerous illusion of all. And it didn't end there. After the baths, many Romans attended banquets. They reclined on couches, eating with unwashed hands, dipping bread into garum, the fermented fish sauce that was itself a bacteria-laden nightmare. The contamination cycle was complete. The same parasites that thrived in the baths found their way into the food, then back into the people. Every Roman feast was a microscopic reunion of everything that had crawled through the sewers earlier that day. Still, the culture glorified it. Poets praised the gleam of the marble pools. Artists painted murals of bathers laughing in golden light. Tourists from distant provinces marveled at the engineering. None of them saw the reality, that Rome's obsession with cleanliness was built on a mountain of filth. They had mistaken decay for sophistication, disease for progress. Modern historians now understand what the Romans never could. Their baths were breeding grounds for dysentery, typhoid, and parasitic worms. Skeletons excavated near ancient bathhouses show evidence of chronic infections and anemia caused by intestinal parasites. In some cases, the worms grew so large they blocked the intestines entirely. The victims would die slowly, bloated and feverish, all while believing their daily baths had made them stronger. It's almost poetic in a horrifying way. The empire that gave the world aqueducts, concrete, and paved roads couldn't grasp the simplest truth about health. Their grandest achievements, the very symbols of Roman superiority, were quietly destroying them from the inside out. And yet, every evening, as the last rays of sunlight glimmered off the mosaic floors, more citizens filed in. They stripped, they scraped, they soaked. They laughed and gossiped, blissfully unaware that the steam rising around them carried death in every breath. That was the heart of Roman hygiene, a civilization choking on its own vanity. By the 3rd century, the Roman obsession with bathing had reached absurd levels. Some citizens visited the baths multiple times a day, not for cleanliness, but for social validation. To skip a bath was to risk ridicule. It didn't matter that the water was foul or that people routinely fell ill afterward. It was about image, reputation, and belonging. You bathed because everyone else did. You bathed because Rome told you it made you civilized. But if you could see what was floating beneath the surface, you'd never step foot in one again. Let's talk about what that water actually contained. In sediment samples from ancient Roman drains, scientists have found human feces, pus, menstrual blood, lice, and even pieces of intestinal parasites. People bled into the pools, vomited in them, and relieved themselves without shame. There were no filters, no drains that led to modern sewage systems. The water was changed maybe once a week, sometimes once a month. Everything else just lingered, a soup of human remains disguised as luxury. The temperature of the caldarium, the hottest bath, helped release a constant mist of organic decay. Breathing it in meant inhaling bacteria straight into your lungs. And still, this was where Romans celebrated birthdays, business deals, and even religious ceremonies. There were musicians, masseurs, and prostitutes. The line between leisure and depravity was paper-thin. Men reclined on marble benches, while slaves rubbed them down with oil made from rancid olives. Others dipped bread into wine as they floated shoulder to shoulder in murky water that looked like broth. To the Romans, this was pleasure. To us, it's biological warfare disguised as wellness. What makes it worse is how they reused everything, the water, the tools, even the oil scraped from bodies. Nothing went to waste in the Roman world, not even human filth. After scraping off sweat and dirt, attendants collected the gray sludge, filtered it, and sold it again. It was rubbed into skin as a moisturizer or burned in lamps. And the smell? Imagine a mix of rotten olives and corpse oil. It clung to everything. The very scent of Roman cleanliness was decay. The disease spread didn't stop at the baths. The water used there flowed into the same sewers that fed into Rome's water systems. That's right. The baths contaminated the entire city. Parasite eggs and bacteria washed into aqueduct runoff, mixing with drinking water and irrigation channels. Food grown with this water was infected before it even reached the markets. Roundworm, whipworm, and tapeworm eggs clung to vegetables and fruits. Romans believed washing produce in bath water made it pure. In reality, it only seasoned their meals with invisible death. Archaeologists found evidence of this in the remains of Roman latrines and sewer systems. Layers of compacted waste reveal the same parasites appearing generation after generation. Nothing changed. They kept bathing, eating, and dying the same way for centuries, a cycle of luxury and disease that never broke until the empire itself began to crumble. But why didn't anyone stop it? Because the baths weren't just about health. They were about propaganda. The emperors understood the power of image. The glittering marble halls, the statues of gods, the fountains, all of it was meant to show the superiority of Roman civilization. Citizens entered those spaces and felt awe. They forgot about the stench, the infections, the sores. The baths made them feel part of something eternal. They were bathing an empire itself, even as it poisoned them. The rot wasn't just physical, it was moral. In those steamy chambers, Rome's sense of discipline dissolved. Adultery, gambling, and prostitution became part of the daily ritual. The line between a public bath and a brothel blurred. Some bathhouses even had secret rooms where senators met courtesans while pretending to discuss politics. Diseases that spread through skin contact found new highways through the city's elite. The same men who debated philosophy by day carried syphilis-like infections home by night. The baths weren't cleansing the empire, they were rotting it from its core. By this point, the Roman idea of cleanliness had turned into something grotesque. Physicians claimed the baths restored balance to the body's humors, but their cures were just as horrifying as their hygiene. They prescribed human urine as antiseptic, recommended swallowing powdered lead to treat stomach aches, and applied mixtures of pig fat and ashes to infected wounds. They thought pain meant progress. They thought suffering meant purity. And because the Roman world prized endurance above all else, people obeyed. Imagine stepping into a bath at the height of the empire's power. The water looks golden under torchlight, but it's only the oil floating on the surface. Beneath it, the heat stirs up sediment, skin flakes, dirt, blood, parasites. You wade in anyway, because your friends are there, because it's what everyone does. The moment your skin touches the water, tiny organisms crawl into your pores. You feel warmth, relaxation, belonging. What you don't feel is the beginning of an infection that will make you feverish by morning. When the Romans left the baths, they believed themselves renewed, pure, almost divine. They didn't realize they were carrying microscopic evidence of their own downfall. The empire's greatest achievement, the aqueducts that powered their bathhouses, became conduits for death. Every drop of water that flowed through Rome carried the seeds of decay. Modern scientists believe that these constant disease outbreaks weakened the population over generations. Children were born sickly. Soldiers on campaign suffered chronic infections. The empire that had once conquered continents now struggled to sustain its own people. The public baths, once a symbol of unity and power, became monuments to arrogance. They showed the world that even the greatest civilization could drown in its own illusions. And yet, there's something haunting about it. The marble still stands today. The mosaics still gleam under sunlight. Tourists walk through the ruins, imagining elegance and beauty, unaware of the stench that once filled those halls. They take pictures beside pools that once boiled with bacteria, never realizing those waters once held the DNA of thousands of forgotten Romans. What was once sacred now lies silent, the ghosts of disease buried in stone. The truth about Roman baths isn't just that they were dirty. It's that they perfectly reflected the empire that built them. Beautiful on the surface, rotting underneath. Every glimmer of luxury hid a secret of suffering. And by the time Rome realized it, the infection had already reached its heart. As the centuries passed, the Roman bathhouses only grew grander and filthier. Emperors competed to outdo one another, commissioning massive complexes that could hold thousands of people. The baths of Diocletian, the largest of them all, could fit over 3,000 bathers at once. They were lined with marble, adorned with statues, and surrounded by gardens. From the outside, they looked like temples of the gods. But step inside, and the illusion shattered. The air was heavy with the stench of rot masked by perfume. The sound of splashing mixed with laughter, coughing, and the faint gurgle of overflowing drains. Rome had turned disease into a daily spectacle. Underneath those marble floors, massive furnaces burned day and night, feeding the hypocaust system that heated the baths. Slaves tended those fires, drenched in sweat and soot, inhaling smoke until their lungs bled. They were the unseen casualties of Rome's obsession with luxury. Men who kept the illusion alive at the cost of their health. Some collapsed from exhaustion and were simply replaced. The fires never went out, even as the bodies of those who fueled them did. The warmth the citizens enjoyed above was literally built on human suffering. But the real horror was the water itself. Rome's engineers were geniuses at moving water, but they didn't understand contamination. The aqueducts carried clean water in, yes, but they also carried used bath water out into rivers and canals that fed right back into the system. There was no separation between fresh and foul. The same water that washed dirt off a senator's back in the morning might fill a child's cup by evening. Over time, the buildup of waste created a feedback loop of infection. Parasites thrived, epidemics spread, and because the Romans valued appearances over science, no one dared to question it. Even the doctors of the time couldn't see what was happening. They believed the disease came from bad air, from the wrath of the gods, from imbalance in the body's fluids. The concept of invisible killers in the water was beyond imagination. So when people fell sick, they blamed it on fate. They prayed harder, bathed longer, and unknowingly worsened the problem. The more they sought purity, the filthier they became. In the smaller local baths, things were even worse. Without the grand infrastructure of the imperial complexes, the water sat stagnant for weeks. Algae grew on the walls. Worms floated near the surface. The stench was unbearable. Yet these places were packed every day. Farmers, merchants, and beggars all crowded together, soaking in the same infected pools. Diseases didn't discriminate. Rich or poor, all were equal in the eyes of bacteria. The baths also became a breeding ground for what we would now call sexually transmitted diseases. In the dim steam, physical boundaries dissolved. Prostitutes worked openly, and public indecency was common. Skin-to-skin contact, shared oils, and unsanitary tools spread infections rapidly. Historians believe syphilis-like diseases were rampant centuries before they were formally recognized. And because the baths were central to social life, the infections reached every corner of society, from the brothels of the Subura to the palaces on the Palatine Hill. When the Romans began to notice the rising tide of sickness, they did what they always did, turned it into ritual. They built more shrines inside the baths. They offered sacrifices to Asclepius, the god of healing. Priests sprinkled incense on the water, believing smoke could purify it. But no amount of prayer could kill bacteria. The result was tragic. Thousands of people bathed in sacred filth, convinced they were washing away sin when in truth, they were baptizing themselves in disease. And the irony doesn't end there. Rome's obsession with bathing may have directly contributed to its downfall. As plague swept through the empire, the very places designed to symbolize unity became engines of death. The Antonine Plague, which killed millions, spread through the water systems. The plague of Cyprian decimated entire legions. Soldiers weakened by disease couldn't fight. Farmers were too sick to harvest crops. Cities shrank, economies collapsed, and enemies took advantage. All the while, Rome's citizens continued their rituals, stepping into the baths that had become silent executioners. Meanwhile, the empire's elites found new ways to turn sickness into spectacle. Gladiator blood was sold as a cure for epilepsy. The oil scraped from athletes' bodies was bottled as perfume. And the sludge collected from bath floors, yes, the same gray mixture of sweat, dirt, and oil, was used in cosmetics. Wealthy women smeared it on their faces, believing it contained the essence of vitality. Others mixed it with crushed pearls or crocodile dung for extra glow. These were the beauty secrets of ancient Rome, rituals that would make any modern dermatologist faint. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed, the baths stood as silent witnesses to centuries of self-inflicted decay. The great furnaces went cold, the echoes of laughter and splashing faded into whispers among the ruins. Water, once flowing from aqueducts with divine precision, now seeped through cracks, turning the marble floors green with mold. The empire that had once prided itself on cleanliness had drowned in its own filth, undone not by invading armies, but by invisible enemies it never understood. Archaeologists who've excavated the remains of these bathhouses describe layers of hardened grime thicker than cement. The drains are clogged with human hair, the pipes crusted with mineral deposits and bacteria turned to stone. Under microscopes, researchers have found traces of intestinal worms, lice, and even fecal matter fossilized in the sediment. 2,000 years later, the dirt of Rome still tells its story. A story not of glory, but of arrogance, the kind that mistakes comfort for progress. To understand how deep the delusion ran, you have to look at how Romans viewed the body. They saw it as a reflection of divine perfection, a vessel worthy of sculpting, worship, and display. Every bath, every oil, every scrape was a ritual of pride. But in chasing perfection, they destroyed the very thing they worshipped. The marble bodies of their statues remained pure while their living ones rotted from disease. The baths became theaters of denial, where people pretended to cleanse themselves while festering inside. And the danger wasn't confined to the bathhouses. It spread through every corner of Roman life. The same water that fed the baths flowed into fountains, kitchens, and vineyards. Lead poisoning from their pipes caused generations of infertility and madness. Parasites weakened armies. Epidemics cut through cities like wildfire. The more the empire bathed, the sicker it became. What began as a symbol of progress ended as a cycle of death disguised as luxury. When historians talk about Rome's fall, they mention corruption, invasions, and political chaos. But few talk about the biological rot. Few mention that Rome's greatest public institution was also its most efficient disease factory. By the 3rd century, entire neighborhoods were dependent on contaminated water systems. The baths, the toilets, the fountains, they were all connected in a network that looked like brilliance on the outside but functioned like a sewer underneath. Rome's glory was quite literally built on waste. The irony is that after the fall of the empire, Europe turned away from bathing entirely. For centuries, people associated washing with sickness, believing that water opened the pores to disease. It took over 1,000 years for humanity to unlearn the lesson Rome had burned into history. Only with modern sanitation and germ theory did bathing become truly clean again. And even now, when we step into our showers or soak in a hot bath, we are repeating a ritual that was once deadly. Imagine standing today inside the ruins of the baths of Caracalla. The mosaics are faded, the pools empty, the air still. It's hard to picture the thousands of bodies that once filled this space, steaming and sweating under torchlight. Harder still to imagine the invisible storm of bacteria that danced through the air, the worms drifting beneath the water's surface. Yet if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the echo of splashes, laughter and coughing, the whispers of an empire that thought it had conquered the world, even as it was conquered by its own ignorance. The Romans gave us roads, law and architecture that still shape our world. But they also gave us a warning. Progress without understanding is just polished decay. Their baths were the pinnacle of engineering and the graveyard of common sense. They teach us that civilization isn't defined by luxury. It's defined by awareness. And the moment pride blinds a people to their own filth, collapse becomes inevitable. So the next time you romanticize ancient Rome, the marble, the glory, the grandeur, remember what was hiding beneath the shine. Remember the filth under their feet, the worms in their bellies, the oil slicks floating on their sacred waters. They thought they were washing away sin. What they were really doing was marinating in it. And tonight, when you step into your own bathroom, alone, clean, with running water that won't poison you, take a second to appreciate it. The private bathroom you take for granted is safer, healthier, and more luxurious than anything the Caesars ever knew. You live better than emperors because you know what they didn't. That true cleanliness isn't about marble halls or public spectacle. It's about hygiene, science, and humility. If you made it this far without losing your appetite, congratulations. You now know the unfiltered truth about Rome's dirtiest secret. Which part shocked you the most? The communal oil scraping, the recycled bath water, or the beauty creams made of gladiator grime? Tell me in the comments. And if you thought this was disturbing, just wait until you see what the Romans did to their emperors in the bathroom. That's right, many of them didn't die in bed. They died on the toilet. So hit like, subscribe, and join me for the next deep dive into history's most horrifying details. Until then, wash your hands, privately, and with actual soap.